Welcome back to the small group for week 4, which means you've made it past the midway point of our study. I hope that you're learning, growing, practicing, and maybe even struggling a little bit with this study through the Lord's Prayer. I know I've been challenged to think differently about my prayers and creating space to simply be with God. It's truly making a big difference for me at this particular time in my life. You've heard by now that the only thing we know of that the disciples ever asked Jesus to teach them was this: Jesus, teach us to pray. His answer is what we know as the Lord's Prayer. Maybe you would just read it with me to remind ourselves of what Jesus taught. Matthew chapter 6, you should pray like this: Our Father in heaven, your name be honored and holy. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. It's worth repeating every week that the first part of the prayer and our time in prayer is setting the table for everything that follows. When we have the essential big rocks in place, we're ready for what's next. Our God is holy and invites us to call him Father, and remember, God, your will be done, meaning you have put yourself in position and decided ahead of time to accept God's answer for what follows. And all of that is a setup to ask for what we need. So this week we're going to focus on that line in verse 11, give us today our daily bread. At the very first and surface reading, can we at least agree that it's great news that Jesus loves bread? Which means we can know for a fact that Jesus would never order a burger without a bun. Now, seriously, the literal translation of this phrase would be today's bread. Jesus, give us today's bread. I love bread, probably a little bit too much, but it's the first thing that you often get served in a lot of restaurants. Whenever I order a sandwich, almost every place I'm presented with multiple choices and asked this question: what kind of bread do you want that on? Bread was very much a staple in the diet of people in the first century too. It's something that could easily fill up a hungry person. It's something that was served at every meal, and it still is. More than just being a staple in their diet, everyone who heard Jesus say these words would immediately think back to bread as a symbol in the history of Israel. Specifically, it was a symbol of God's provision for people. You can read all about this in great detail in the book of Exodus. God had used a man named Moses to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. The cinematic highlight was escaping through the Red Sea when the people walked across on dry ground, and then the water came back and covered up the army of Pharaoh. And when the Israelites escaped, they were led into the wilderness, or the desert, on their way to the promised land that they've been told about. It's here in the desert that the people needed to learn some lessons about themselves and about God. They quickly forgot what life was like in slavery. They complained relentlessly to go back to where they came from with a very short-sighted request. Hey, at least we had really good food back there. And God's response to Moses about all of this was to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Every day I'm going to send bread down from heaven. When you wake up in the morning and peel back the tent, it's going to be all over the ground. And the people can go out, they can collect as much as they want, but there's a little bit of a catch. It's only going to be good for that day. So on day one, people get up, there's a little dew on the ground, and the food is there with it. It's like bread flakes, and the people are pretty excited about that. They say, wow, this is great, but what is it? Now we know that it's called manna, but you may not know that manna actually means that very thing. What is it? So the people gathered it, they collected it, they ate it, and because those people are a lot like we are, some of them were a little concerned about having enough. Some of them were a little concerned about whether or not was God going to do this same thing again tomorrow or the day after that. So they actually collected more than they really needed for that day. And then on day 2, when they went to their supply, it had already gone bad. And the lesson that God wanted to teach people was, you need to be totally dependent on me for what you need. Not next week and not tomorrow, but today. Jesus dropped that timeless image into people's minds when he said, pray this way, give us today's bread. I've spent a good bit of time in different countries around the world, mostly third world countries. If you've ever been able to do that, you understand a little bit about having bread just for today. Maybe it's because there's no refrigeration, and maybe it's because people only have enough money for that particular day. But there's been many times I've walked with local residents to the market early in the morning to get only what we needed for that day. Interestingly enough, this word daily is only found in the Bible here in the Lord's Prayer. There's not even a mention of it outside of the Bible in other Greek literature until a few years ago, a piece of papyrus was found that contained a woman's grocery list. On the list were several perishable items, and next to each item she had written this word, meaning enough for the day. For us who live in America, today's culture, in our prosperity, very few of us, if any of us, have ever gone without anything for a long period of time. It's hard to understand just how significant this part of the prayer would be. The first century worker was only paid one day at a time. They didn't receive any sick days. There would have been a legitimate concern about what was going to happen tomorrow. So when you think about that angle, and the fact that God wanted the Israelites to know it wasn't really about the bread, it was about him as the bread provider, maybe it changes a little bit how we view this part of the prayer where we're asking God to give something to us. So let me give you 2 potential takeaways that you can begin applying today, and yet you may actually find them to be a little bit in contrast with one another. Here's one. Ask God for what you need. Martin Luther stated that bread was a symbol for everything necessary for the preservation of this life, like food, a healthy body, good weather, house, home, wife, children, good government, and peace. All of our requests don't have to be spiritual. Bread isn't spiritual. So the principle here is this: if it matters to you, it matters to him. When my kids were younger, they asked for all kinds of things repeatedly and consistently. Dad, the hot light is on, right? Donuts, let's go. And many times my answer was no. Well, why? Because I'm the father and I know more than they do. I know that Krispy Kreme every day is not a good meal plan. But other times I was the one to initiate something and they didn't see it coming, or I could grant a request that they asked for, again, because I'm the father. In the same way, God can decide if what you're asking for is needed for today. So ask God for what you need. Second takeaway, depend on God for what you need. When we really dive into the prayer, this line may actually be less about our list and what we think we need, and maybe it's more, once again, a prayer of declaring our dependence on God. You know, a lot of times what we're asking for is either trivial or miraculous. Those things might range from God, give me a good hair day, to God, make this cancer go away. If you're familiar with the life and ministry of Jesus, you're probably familiar with his miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. You can read all about it in John chapter 6. But Jesus took a boy's lunch, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he multiplied it so that thousands of people ate as much as they wanted, and there were baskets of leftovers. Well, immediately after that, Jesus does this miracle. We have another one where he walks on the water. And the day after these 2 amazing miracles, Jesus and the disciples have some time to discuss things, and what you see is that they're asking him for yet another miracle. Hey, Jesus, you do some amazing tricks. What do you have for us next? And they get into a conversation about the story we referenced in Exodus 16 and the bread that came down from heaven. And Jesus said, oh, what happened way back there is a picture of what is happening right now here. I am the bread of life. And anyone who comes to me will never be hungry. So what if you go ahead and ask God for everything you need, believing that he can figure out what is enough for today? Ask him for the simple and for the miraculous. And yet the presence of Jesus in your life might be enough to satisfy you if your specific prayer isn't answered. Well, what if the prayer, give us today our daily bread, is really a prayer of thanksgiving for Jesus and the miracle that he offers to be with us and live in us? Can Jesus be enough for you for today?